Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest this week is Andrey Shlyakhter. Andrey is the Dina Abramowicz Emerging Scholar Fellow in Eastern European Jewish Studies at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research and a Center Associate with the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Andrey is also a former Title VIII research scholar with the Kennan Institute. His project will serve as the basis for a book and is titled Smuggling Across Soviet Borders, Contraband Trades, Soviet Solutions, and the Shadow of Economic Origins of the Iron Curtain. This is the second part of a two-part discussion. Last week, our guest was Jonathan Brunstad, and we learned about his work. And now, Andrey, great to have you back at the center as well. Welcome.
Thank you, John.
So I had asked in our first segment, I asked Jonathan about how he ended up arriving at his focus, his academic focus. I want to ask you the same question. What's the story behind how you chose smuggling as a focus with all the other various topics that were available to you?
Sure. I think that objects have a certain eloquence to them. And I guess I've always thought that ever since I was little. I was an avid coin collector. And I realized at some point that it wasn't so much the coins I was interested in as the stories behind them. Because once you pick up a coin, you can imagine all the hands that went through all the transactions that played a part in. You know, to this day, I have a here on my keychain. I don't know if you can see it, but this is an Imperial Russian kopeck from 1914, the last year of peace that the empire enjoyed. And
was that part of your childhood collection?
No, this one came later.
More recent.
But it's the same thing. You know, I guess I know a little bit more about the context now than I did when I was a kid. So it was sort of more food for the imagination. But it's the same sort of thing. I think objects carry a lot of emotional and informational weight, and so to tell a story that is around objects was attractive to me. Just more broadly, there is an understanding that you can't understand how the Soviet Union worked without understanding the shadow economy, right? Because the planned economy was only a part of that system, and it was complemented to a great extent by the unplanned, illicit economy. But there, until recently, has not really been much of an effort to historicize that. The shadow economy has a history, but for obvious reasons, it's difficult to study. And the people who have studied it have tended to be social scientists who are focused on more contemporary development, sociologists, anthropologists, economists. And it was only recently that historians have really tried to trace the origins and the development of the Soviet shadow economy. And so what I'm doing is taking a discrete slice of that economy and trying to tell its history and its impact.
Has your research been able to reveal the size of that shadow economy as a percentage of the whole economy?
Yeah, so that is a notoriously difficult thing to do for obvious reasons. In the case of smuggling, the sort of basic data point are seizures of contraband goods by the authorities. But you don't really know if a spike in the seizures reflects a spike in smuggling or a spike in policing. This is a kind of standard criminological conundrum. That was actually one reason that in my dissertation, which I defended last year at the University of Chicago, I looked at smuggling not from the Soviet point of view, but from the point of view of the Soviet Union's neighbors. I looked at the records of Polish, Latvian, and Estonian government officials and businessmen to reconstruct the view not from the Kremlin west, but from Warsaw, Riga, and Tallinn east. And that allowed me to actually talk, I think, with a little bit more authority about what was actually happening, because I wasn't so much relying on the sources of the police, but I was relying on the sources from the side that was actually encouraging this kind of trade, because they see the interesting thing, the dynamic that obtained on the Soviet frontier during the period that I study after the revolution. It was a kind of schizoid dynamic where the trade was considered illegal on the Soviet side, but very much encouraged by the Soviet Union's neighbors. There are many reasons for this. These countries that I discussed in my dissertation, Poland, Latvia, and Estonia, had all been part of the Russian Empire. So their economies were intimately enmeshed with that system and only made sense in that system. So Latvia's capital, Riga, was the busiest commercial seaport of the entire empire. Tallinn was one of the busiest. And Poland produced a major proportion of all the textiles of the empire. And the imperial market is what made the Polish textile industry possible. And that was the major industry in the entire land. And so for them, smuggling allowed a chance to reconnect with their former market. And so this was something they encouraged. Yeah.
Is there any way to measure in which direction the majority of the smuggled goods traveled? Was it in or out?
So goods primarily traveled into the Soviet Union, and there was all sorts of reasons for that. Soon after coming to power, the Bolsheviks announced that all foreign trade was to be a monopoly of the government. And in this, they had some precedent in the Tsarist wartime economy, where the state tried to control what was coming in and out for reasons of wartime mobilization, but the Bolsheviks took it much further. And there were also all sorts of reasons for this. This had to do with the belief that they needed to husband scarce resources, that their belief in the power of planning, which was a central tenet of their program, the belief that modernization requires a kind of targeted use of resources without the kind of anarchy of the market, and so on. And so that, of course, left a wide niche for private demand that was unfilled, because, as we know, central planning can only go so far. So that was the kind of major cause. When there were others, like I said, the parts of the empire had fallen off that had been producing for the imperial market, like Poland. And so that left a wide niche for all kinds of consumer goods. Coming out to pay for those goods were more portable valuables, gold, platinum, furs, precious stones, and the like. So in terms of volume and weight, the things were coming in, but of course, some sort of corresponding value was coming in.
I've read that you've described this response to smuggling as something way more complex than simple enforcement, build a wall, that type of thing. That I think you've used the phrase that there was looking under the rug, and that what emerged is something that was way beyond simple contraband control. It was something greater. How would you describe that greater thing, and who was the architect of this very sophisticated response?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked about this. This is the thing that initially I found most surprising, which is that the Soviet authorities did not only respond with the stick, which was punishing smugglers, putting more barbed wire and more sentries at the border, but they also responded with a kind of carrot, the effort to meet demand for smuggled goods. And this reflected, first of all, a certain optimism, the belief that early on that the Soviet system could produce. And this was spearheaded actually by Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was famously known as the founder of the Soviet secret police, but who was also the head of the chief industrial planning trust. And so he combined these two approaches. On the one hand, the kind of fearsome enforcement and punishment, but on the other hand, this effort to study what was being smuggled on the basis of these confiscated goods, and then try and use that information to tweak domestic production and distribution. This was an effort that Dzerzhinsky pursued quite vigorously until his death in 1926. Subsequently, however, it was the government's other economic priorities, the development of heavy industry, especially the need to move resources away from the consumer sector, that confronted them with the reality that while they would have wanted to meet this demand, it was simply not something they could afford. And they talk very explicitly about this in the documents, that given the competing priorities, we have to rely more on forceful measures. And so this is, I think, actually one of the interesting sort of broader findings, the relationship between state poverty and the state's effort to modernize rapidly and the use of violence and coercion. I don't think you can understand Stalinist violence and coercion without reference to resource constraints, and that this choice was informed and shaped by the poverty of the Soviet state.
So when Russians look back at that moment and at that approach, and how is it viewed? Is it viewed as successful for a while, but then needed to evolve? Is it viewed as failed? What is the measure when they look back at what was attempted then? And does it have any application to border control today?
Yeah, this story is not well known. I am sort of recovering this story, and it'll be interesting to see
what kind of reactions you get.
the reactions I get, exactly, and so on. I think I'm sort of complicating a simpler narrative that would privilege policing and so on. But I think there's a significance to the policing that, and it's a more interesting phenomenon than one might imagine, because it was in the reaction to this challenge posed by contraband that the Soviet system of border control was born. Because contraband trade was the major challenge over the course of the 1920s. It was most likely the activity that border guards spent most of their time pursuing. And it is in response to this challenge that so many of the elements of what would eventually become the Iron Curtain were introduced. A system of informants in the border areas, areas where the police had extra authority, forbidden zones, and of course, the growth of the border guard and the physical infrastructure, the barbed wire, the searchlights, all of that. And so I think there's a broader story there, and it is that it is in response. It is that challenges to state authority, be it smuggling or other challenges as well, and there were certainly others, guerrilla incursions, brigands, espionage, peasant uprisings. It is challenges to Soviet authority that caused the system to grow muscle, right? And so that I think is somewhat counterintuitive and has a broader implication because states often grow in response, state power grows in response to such challenges. And you see that elsewhere here in the United States, the growth of state power on our Mexican border as a response to challenges and such as migration and drug trafficking, and then of course the co-optation of these challenges by political entrepreneurs who would point to them for their own sort of domestic agenda reasons.
You know, we lived through a period where globalization was driving the discussion, and there was dreams of a borderless world. And now you just summarized the contemporary moment where borders seem to be getting thicker, or at least that's the desire of many governments or regimes. What does your research tell you in terms of what the trend lines say in this regard? Is this just a hiccup, a moment in slowing down globalization, or are we going to see an increased emphasis on tighter borders? If you don't want to hazard a guess here, I'd understand, because predictions are almost doomed to be wrong in most cases. But I'm just wondering, as you look at that broader picture, as you describe it, where you see the momentum.
Yeah, so although my own research focuses on an earlier period, I think you're right that there's definitely a connection here. And we have tended to think of the post-Cold War world as being more open, more globalized, borders as being a thing of the past. But researchers have shown there's a project on borders, a very interesting project at the University of Pennsylvania, where they've documented that, in fact, the fortification of borders, barriers, have actually proliferated since the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And there's all sorts of reasons for this. There is concerns about the sort of the undersides of globalization, trafficking, and illegal migration, terrorism, and anxiety about economic globalization, and of course the nativist appeal of these barriers, because those are something that politicians are able to point to as a way of keeping out sort of the scary outside world. And that process has actually accelerated. More and more the border barriers have been built in this century. And so actually the kind of international lockdowns that have taken place just over the last 2 years, they turbocharged an already accelerating trend. So I think that borders are here to stay. And there are all sorts of unintended consequences where you might close down the border to face one threat, and that might reverberate across other flows. So I think there is value in considering the origins of those systems.
And if borders are here to stay, is smuggling here to stay as well? Do we know from the historic period that you're examining to the present, is smuggling something that has increased or decreased?
Well, I would say, the border is a barrier. The border is also a resource, and that generates its own economy, right? And so, yes, I think that just as borders proliferate, they will create new incentives and new possibilities for arbitrage and structure markets. And I think that this is a side of globalization that will be with us.
And Andrey, I have to ask you the status of the book question, which again, I know is one that can haunt an author. Where are you in the timeline of the project?
So I'm about to embark on an archival research trip to Russia for several months, all permissions pending. And so hopefully we'll come back with a kind of final trove of materials. And I anticipate that I should be able to complete the manuscript sometime before the fall of 2024. So looking forward to that. And
excellent. Well, I hope your time at the Wilson Center was useful in that regard.
It was absolutely critical in this regard. And I'm deeply grateful for the support.
Andrey, thanks very much for joining us, and good luck as you continue with the project. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for everyone at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.